The engine roared as the car ventured deeper into the forest. The night was dark and stormy, with thunder rumbling like the roar of distant beasts. Sarah, Mark, Emily, and John had embarked on a weekend getaway, away from the city and the hustle and bustle of everyday life. The destination was a remote cabin deep in the forest, rented to provide a peaceful retreat. However, as they approached the location, the initial excitement turned into uneasiness. Tall trees leaned over the cabin's wooden roof, creating a scene worthy of a horror story. The rain fell heavily, washing the cabin's windows and turning the dirt path into mud. The car's headlight cut through the darkness and revealed the facade of the cabin. She looked scarier than in her rental photos, and the reality of isolation began to weigh on her friends. As they got out of the car and grabbed their bags, Emily tried to dispel her fear. "Come on, guys, let's not let a storm ruin our fun. This is just part of the adventure." Mark nodded, but his expression was still tense. "Emily's right. We're here to have fun. Let's not let our imaginations get the best of us." Sarah, always the bravest of the group, smiled. "That's it. It's just a cabin in the middle of the woods. What could go wrong?" John, however, was still not convinced. He wondered why anyone would rent such an isolated cabin on a stormy night. It was as if the cabin itself was an invitation into the unknown. The cabin key was waiting in the mailbox, as agreed with the owner. With flashlights in hand, they opened the cabin door and entered. The interior was modest but welcoming. The fireplace crackled in the living room, casting a soft light that chased away the darkness of the night. Rustic furniture and wooden details completed the decor, giving the cabin a cozy feel. As they settled in, the tension began to ease. The friends decided they wouldn't let the storm ruin their weekend. They sat around the fireplace, began to enjoy a home-cooked dinner, and laughed together, remembering stories of their friendship. But as the night wore on and the storm raged outside, the mood began to change. Every creak and creak in the cabin seemed to echo like an unsettling sigh. Friends noticed that their smiles turned into nervous looks. John laughed nervously, trying to diffuse the tension. "I think we're getting scared of our own imagination. It's just the sounds of nature." Mark agreed, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Maybe we've been watching too many horror movies lately?" Emily tried to calm everyone down. "Let's forget about this and continue enjoying our night. We're here to relax, aren't we?" They spent the evening playing board games and laughing in front of the roaring fireplace. The friendly atmosphere began to dispel the fear they had felt. But as the night wore on and the storm raged outside, a sense of unrest began to creep into their minds. The sound of the rain hitting the windows and the howling of the wind in the hallways created an atmosphere they couldn't ignore. It was as if the forest itself was watching them, waiting for something. The next morning, the weather improved, and the friends decided to explore the cabin's surroundings. The surrounding forest looked inviting in the sunlight, and they convinced themselves that the feeling of restlessness the night before was nothing more than imagination. As they walked through the forest, the fresh air and natural beauty calmed them. They explored trails, found a stream, and took photos to record their adventure. Mark even joked that they were living their own version of a horror movie. However, as the afternoon progressed, something began to disturb the peace they had found. Mark noticed something strange on the ground, a series of footprints that seemed to lead directly to the cabin. "That's strange. Has anyone been here recently?" Emily approached the footprints. "It looks like someone was watching the cabin. Maybe it was a curious neighbor." Sarah wasn't convinced. Why would anyone come near the cabin at night? That doesn't make sense. They discussed the mystery of the footprints, but were unable to find a logical explanation. They decided to continue exploring, but the feeling that they were being watched didn't leave them. As the sun began to set and daylight began to disappear, they decided to return to the cabin. They walked hurriedly, as the darkness of the forest seemed to swallow the trail behind them. As they returned, John looked into the dense forest around them and saw a shadowy figure moving through the trees. "You guys saw that, right?" The friends turned, but the figure had disappeared into the darkness of the forest. Their hearts quickened, and a feeling of restlessness took over. They knew something wasn't right. Emily stammered, "It could be one of our friends trying to scare us, right?" Mark shook his head. "No, they wouldn't do that. Not after last night." Sarah approached John and took his arm. "Let's go back to the cabin. I don't want to stay here when night falls." They returned to the cabin, feeling increasingly uncomfortable as the shadows of the forest lengthened. Whatever they had seen in the forest tormented them. When they entered the cabin, they locked all the doors and windows as a precaution. Night was approaching, and the feeling that something was wrong didn't leave them. As they gathered in the living room, mysterious noises began to echo throughout the cabin. Creaks, rustles, and light footsteps disturbed what should have been a peaceful night. Mark suggested that wind and old wood were to blame, but no one was convinced. Fear began to creep in again, and they huddled closer to the fireplace, trying to convince themselves that they were safe. However, something in the darkness outside the window was watching them, waiting for its opportunity. As the night progressed, the friends settled into their rooms in the cabin. Each of them was fighting the uneasy feeling that hung over the house, but exhaustion finally overcame them, and they fell asleep. However, their sleep was disturbed by vivid and frightening nightmares. Sarah dreamed that she was lost in the dark forest, with ominous shadows writhing around her. Mark dreamed that the cabin was slowly sinking into the ground, while Emily found herself trapped in a nightmare in which a hooded figure relentlessly chased her. John, in turn, was dreaming of the same shadowy figure he had seen in the forest, only now it was inside the cabin, watching him as he slept. The friends woke up with a start, their hearts racing, and shared their nightmares with each other. The atmosphere in the cabin was charged with tension, and they couldn't escape the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next morning, they decided to go out to get some fresh air and clear their minds. The forest seemed more welcoming in daylight, and they hoped exposure to the sun would dispel the previous night's fears. As they walked through the woods, Mark suggested they investigate the area around the cabin for clues that could explain the mysterious events. Emily agreed, and they began exploring the cabin's surroundings. While investigating the outside of the cabin, John noticed that one of the windows was ajar, although they were sure they had locked it the night before. He frowned and pushed the window closed, but it gave way with an unsettling creak. "That's weird," John muttered. "We locked her up, I'm sure." Sarah became restless. Could someone have entered the cabin while we were sleeping? Mark decided to check the cabin's interior for signs of intruders, while Emily and John continued to explore the surroundings for clues. Mark found no signs of forced entry, but the half-open window left him perplexed. He decided to lock it again, but the feeling that they were being watched wouldn't leave him. As Emily and John explored the surrounding forest, Emily noticed something shining among the fallen leaves. They discovered a small metallic object, a silver medallion with mysterious inscriptions. It looked old and worn out by time. "What do you think this is?" Emily asked, holding the locket in her shaking hands. John looked at the inscriptions and frowned. "I have no idea, but this is strange. It must have some meaning." They decided to take the medallion back to the cabin to show it to the others and see if anyone knew anything about it. As they walked back, however, a quick shadow passed them in the forest, leaving them with a feeling of dread. They couldn't see what it was, but they knew they weren't alone. Back at the cabin, they showed the medallion to the others. No one had any idea what those inscriptions meant, but everyone agreed that something was happening in that cabin and in those woods that they could not explain. Night approached again, and the friends decided that they would not spend another night in the cabin. Something sinister was happening, and they couldn't ignore the strange events they witnessed. They decided that they would leave the next morning and report what they had experienced to the police. But as the sun set and darkness swallowed the forest, a sense of panic came over them. They knew they would face the unknown that night. As night fell on the isolated cabin in the woods, the friends gathered in the living room, with worried looks and flashlights in hand. The feeling that something terrible was about to happen consumed them. They knew they could no longer ignore the mysterious events that had plagued them throughout their stay. "Can't we wait until morning to get out of here?" Emily suggested, her voice shaking. John agreed. "I can't bear another night of feeling like we're being watched." Mark, although nervous, insisted that they needed to find out the truth. "We have to face this, find out what's going on. We can't just run away." Sarah, the bravest of the group, decided to lead the expedition. "That's right. Let's investigate what's going on. Maybe we'll find some clue that explains all of this." Determined to confront the mystery that hung over the cabin, they grabbed their flashlights and headed out into the darkness of the forest. The night was calm, and the forest looked like a completely different place under the moonlight. The friends walked silently along the path that had led them to the cabin and slowly approached the half-open window they had found earlier. As they approached the cabin, Sarah saw something that made her stop abruptly. In the half-open window, a shadow moved as if someone were inside the cabin. She pointed her flashlight toward the window and saw eyes glowing in the darkness. Someone was definitely in the cabin. The friends looked at each other in shock and silently decided to approach the back door, hoping to catch the intruder by surprise. Mark approached carefully and slowly turned the door handle, which opened silently. They entered the cabin with flashlights on, prepared to face whatever was inside. The living room was empty, but flashlights revealed clues of recent activity. Furniture was out of place, and mud marks littered the floor. The feeling that they were being watched was overwhelming. Emily whispered nervously, "Whoever it is, it's in here. We need to find them." John agreed, his voice shaking. "Let's search every room carefully." Sarah led the group, pushing open the bedroom door carefully. There, they saw the shadowy figure that watched them. A man in a dark cloak, empty eyes, and a sadistic smile on his face. He was standing in the middle of the room, looking at them. The silence of the night was broken by a collective scream of terror. The hooded man didn't move, but his piercing gaze seemed to pierce through their souls. Mark was the first to recover his voice. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" The man maintained his sadistic smile and did not respond. Instead, he disappeared in a blur of shadows, as if he had never been there. Sarah ran to the window, watching the man disappear into the dark night. "He's getting away. We have to catch him." The friends left the cabin in pursuit, but the hooded man had disappeared into the forest. They followed him for some time, but the feeling that they were being watched did not leave them. The forest seemed to close in on them, and they realized they were in unfamiliar territory. Terrified and without any clues as to the identity of the hooded man, the friends decided to return to the cabin. They knew they could not continue their search in that frightening darkness. Back at the cabin, they locked all the doors and windows, feeling more insecure than ever. They knew that the night would bring no relief and that the mystery was far from solved. As the night wore on, the friends settled into the living room, lanterns lit. The feeling that something terrible was lurking in the shadows tormented them. The nightmare that had begun with a peaceful escape had turned into a true tale of horror. Whatever the hooded man was, and whatever he wanted, remained a terrifying mystery.